Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Wire Forest. I would like to focus my remarks, Mr Deputy Speaker, on issues which have been at the forefront of my constituents' concerns over the past year. And obviously the recession has been one of the biggest problems that my constituents, as many honourable members, if not all, have been facing, and how that has impacted on them. I've spent a lot of time going around speaking to local businesses in my constituency, and I have to say I continue to be very frustrated by the stories I hear from local businesses which are viable, which have sound order books, which are able to get through this recession, if it were not for the threats hanging over them because their banks are suddenly withdrawing credit or charging huge interest rates on overdrafts. And despite many representations that I've made and that I've heard many other honourable members make to the Chancellor in this, it seems that even for those banks where the state is a major shareholder, we, for some reason, seem to be unwilling to use that influence to get these banks lending to what are viable businesses. Now, I've experienced some of my companies in my constituency going to the wall, and therefore there being redundancies, and what I would hate to see is for more viable businesses that could continue and survive this recession having to suffer the same fate. Also, on the subject of banks, I have been very dismayed by the result of the recent court case about bank charges, and I know that that's something which is also widely shared. The punitive fees which many banks charge for going even a slight amount overdrawn, and then they compound because a daily fee is charged, and so even for being £1 overdrawn, people can end up accruing over £100 worth of charges in just a few days. This is clearly not related to the costs of the banks actually processing that kind of spontaneous overdraft, and in fact are just a way of clawing back money, and a large proportion of banks' profits is actually made up from these charges, often being applied to very vulnerable people. And given the court decision, I would very much like to see the government bringing forward legislation to ensure that banks are only able to make fair charges that are relating to the costs of the additional administration work that is incurred when people do go overdrawn.
Would my honourable friend like?
I certainly will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Should we be aware that the point that was decided in the Abbey National case was a very narrow one, and the Supreme Court gave a very clear steer that the Government and Parliament may wish to revisit this, and indeed that the OFT could in fact bring proceedings under Section 140 of the Consumer Credit Act 1974. Would you join me in making that call for early action?
I certainly would. My honourable friend makes his point very well indeed, and this is something which does, particularly in a recession, require urgent action from the government and indeed bodies such as the OFT. I mentioned redundancy, which is obviously something which has affected many of my constituents, but I would also add to that the fear of unemployment, which hangs over many people, adding to stress and creating problems within the home, and that is something which our constituents are all facing on a regular basis. On a slight positive note, in my own constituency of East Dunbartonshire, there has been good news with the unemployment figures in the last 2 months, with there being a slight drop in the unemployment figures. I do hope this is a trend, but I do fear that in fact it may not be, because we do all know that unemployment tends to be a lagging indicator within recessions, and particularly given that there may be future strictures on the public sector, then there could be more pain to come. As regards those of my constituents who are employed in the civil service, a great many of them have been concerned by the proposed changes to the civil service compensation scheme and how their potential compensation, if made redundant, would be altered. While I do accept the need for this scheme to be amended, I think the current changes as proposed are causing this concern about the inequity between different types of workers, and I do hope the government will listen to the representations that are being made and come forward with amended plans for that scheme. The recession, Mr Deputy Speaker, is hitting savers particularly hard, and the low interest rates, while good for those with mortgages, are quite the opposite for those who are relying on the interest payments from their savings for their basic day-to-day living, and this is causing problems in particular for many older people within my constituency. Many of them are also, unfortunately, victims of the Equitable Life saga, yes, having put savings into a well-respected institution. And I do share the frustration of many MPs. I've called an adjournment debate on this issue. I've attended adjournment debates. There have been ones called by my friend from North Avon. I think the honourable member from the Conservative benches for Shrewsbury in Action has been very active on this, and members from all sides of the House, indeed with the all-party parliamentary group on Equitable Life. It seems that there's just no sort of light at the end of the tunnel, that there's continual delay. We know how the people who have these Equitable Life policies are actually dying before they reach the opportunity of possibly having compensation, and I would urge the government to deal with this and recognise that if you're going to have a parliamentary ombudsman, then it makes sense when they give a ruling, and particularly given that she has been so firm in her ruling on this issue, that that should be followed. East Dunbartonshire is often seen as a very affluent constituency, but that doesn't mean that there is not poverty also, and it's often hidden. Pensioners in particular may live in a large house that has been their family home, but then they face difficulties with fuel poverty trying to heat that home, and indeed large council tax bills, because the council tax system is of course not related to ability to pay and is very unfair in my opinion. We've also in my area had concerns for other elderly people who are requiring care at home, or indeed who are living in sheltered housing accommodation, because East Dunbartonshire Council, like some other local authorities, has tried to introduce charges for things such as sheltered housing wardens, which of course are an essential part of living in that kind of accommodation, which helps people to maintain an independent life for a lot longer, and of course is actually much better value than alternatives of going into much more supported accommodation. I certainly hope that in the difficulties that I know local government will have in balancing the budgets in this recession, that the first port of call for savings is not seen as being some of the most vulnerable people in our society, because that would be very unjust indeed. Turning away from financial issues, they sometimes say that all politics is local, and there have been a variety of very local controversial issues in my constituency recently. The Kilmardinny development is proposed for a piece of land between Milngavie and Bearsden in my constituency, and much of this land has been derelict for some years, such as an old bus station site, although some other of it has been used as for golf and other purposes. There is not general concern that this land should not be developed. People accept that development is appropriate on this land. However, the local council's local plan suggested that 330 houses would be appropriate on this land, and a proposal came forward for 550, which is clear overdevelopment. Despite this being overwhelmingly rejected by the local council more than 2 years ago, we are now in this position where one unelected official, the reporter, will ultimately have the decision on this. And I see some other honourable members nodding that they will have also had such experiences in their own constituencies. In this case, the community gain is very limited. The traffic improvements will probably only counter the increase in traffic problems that would come from having 550 additional houses and the impact that has on local roads. And the £10 million planning gain for a new local leisure centre, of course, doesn't cover the at least £17 million cost of building such a centre. So if the reporter does indeed recommend that this goes ahead with those conditions, then actually the council could be put into a very difficult situation and put under a lot of pressure to accept something where it would end up out of pocket. I certainly will give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady for giving way, and also for the extremely long day she had. I saw her very early this morning on television, and she was working late last night as well. But in Wellingborough we have exactly the same thing. People against the development, against Wellingborough North, the council against it, and lo and behold, someone from the government who doesn't know anything about it can overturn it. Would you agree with me these decisions should be left to local councils?
I would agree. We obviously need to have some kind of appeal system, but I am very frustrated with the way this works currently. I really don't think it's serving local interests well when the people who know best, those who are representing the local area, do get overturned. And in this case, I firmly believe that the Kilmardinny development, as proposed currently, should not and must not go ahead. It's not just house builders, of course. Elsewhere in my constituency, we have the issue of a retail outlet, Tesco, who are well known in the planning issues, have a current application to expand their Milngavie store, to knock down their existing store and actually more than double it in size, effectively placing what would, I imagine, be one of their Tesco Extra stores right next to the town centre. And this is a massive expansion, and I've surveyed my local constituents on this, the 5,500 households affected in the town, and had more than 800 replies. The majority have said that the proposed size of the store is far too big, and also the location of it will end up protruding more than 7 metres high above the road, whereas currently it is set below the road and away from it, and so it is not a sort of monstrosity or an eyesore on the landscape. People are also concerned, as has often been the case with large supermarket developments, about the impact on local shops. We are still lucky in Milngavie to have a great range of independent stores, such as a butcher, ironmonger, a fabulous independent bookshop, confectioners and others. And of course a doubling or more than doubling of a large supermarket in that vicinity could have a very negative impact on those shops too. So I do hope really that these concerns can be taken into account when this particular application is considered, although I have to note that from the experiences of other honourable members, the track record of companies such as Tesco for changing their plans is not necessarily that great. Over in Bishopbriggs, there is a redevelopment also of the town centre, but the current plans again seem to be entirely arranged around creating a Morrison's superstore and a large car park, rather than focusing on other aspects of what makes a town centre, such as community facilities. In fact, the proposals as they stand involve knocking down a sports hall which was built only a few years ago at significant expense, and this is despite a group of volunteers in the community getting together and putting forward a business plan to run this for community gain, which surely is the kind of thing that we should all be encouraging in our local areas. Again, this particular development isn't finally approved, and I would urge developers and the council to take heed of local concerns. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and I would like to share a really excellent example of community action in Kirkintilloch in my constituency. Back in 2003, a group of young people decided they would like to have a skate park in the town. They got together with like-minded people. They lobbied politicians, myself as the MP, or indeed at the time I was standing for the Scottish Parliament. They've lobbied the MSPs, they've lobbied the council, they've fundraised, they've managed to secure grants of £500,000, and they've been very involved in community activities such as litter picks and gala days to raise their profile. And just a couple of weeks ago, the skate park opened, and it's being well used, a healthy activity for young people to socialise and learn mutual respect. And I would like to pay tribute to Susan Murray for her driving this project forward, and also to Alex Bayliss, who when he started out was a skater who was at school, and in the 6 years during which it's taken this park to be built has gone through university, graduated and set up an increasingly successful band called the Accutones. Without them and many other volunteers, this simply would not have been possible. I would like to touch, Mr Deputy Speaker, on just a couple of national issues before concluding. The first one I had hoped to raise in Prime Minister's questions today, but sadly time unfortunately just sped away, and I just missed out getting to my question on the order paper. But that was the important issue of body image, and some members will know that today the Advertising Standards Authority upheld a complaint made through a campaign website that I coordinated about an advert that had been digitally retouched. It was an advert for an oil of Olay anti-wrinkle cream, and clearly in such an advert to retouch the wrinkles out of the picture is somewhat misleading, and I'm glad that the ASA has upheld that. But this is a wider issue, and there's a lot of academic evidence which shows that these kind of idealised, heavily retouched images that we see in the media are damaging to health and self-esteem of young people, but actually also of all ages and of both women and men. And I would like to see adverts labelled to show the extent to which they have been digitally retouched. And I very much hope to return to this issue in the new year and possibly even try to secure a fuller debate on this subject. I would also just like to mention the issue of political reform. And I think we would all accept that 2009 has been a somewhat difficult year for politics and our democracy. Having had the expenses scandal, the public is understandably quite angry with what has gone on. And I would actually add that I'm sure that I'm not alone in thinking this, that quite a lot of MPs are quite angry with some of what has gone on as well, because I'm sure many of us were unaware of the extent to which expenses were being used for purposes that perhaps we would not have expected. What I would like to say is that we need to grasp this opportunity to rebuild our politics and to make changes which I believe will make our politics much stronger in the long run. This is a real opportunity. We need to make sure we make progress with reform of the House of Lords, for example. The Prime Minister recently said he was in favour of votes at 16. That's Liberal Democrat policy, it's Labour Party policy, I understand it's the policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party. And I would just say, well, let's bring forward an amendment to an existing bill or a short bill, and let's actually put that into practice. Right of recall for MPs, there again have been private members' bills on that, and there is increasing consensus on that. We can make these changes so that constituents have some power in between elections if their MP is found to have been doing something wrong, that they actually don't just have to lump it, but they can actually take action to cause a by-election. Electoral reform, I believe strongly, should be back on the agenda, and indeed reform of this House. And I would urge members to look very carefully at the Right Committee proposals to help to make sure the agenda of Parliament is set by a cross-party committee and it's set by Parliament rather than the government, to make sure that select committee chairs are elected rather than stitched up in smoke-filled rooms, and indeed to look at more ways that the public can interact with Parliament and perhaps even initiate proceedings in Parliament, whether that's through suggestions for topical debates or other methods. I don't believe that the right proposals personally are the entire solution, and indeed I don't think they go far enough, but I do believe they're a step in the right direction. And so I very much welcome Mr Speaker earlier today in response to a point of order from my honourable friend, the member for Somerton and Frome, inferring that he didn't have any reason to believe that these proposals would not be coming towards the House, and I do hope voted on in the new year, because I think this will be a very important piece of reform for the House to get through. I would like to give a sincere thanks to the members of my staff, Hannah Wright, Karen Hurst, Jamie McHale and Mark MacDonald, who have been absolutely fantastic this year in helping me serve my constituents through both my Bishopbriggs and my Westminster offices. And I would like to end, Mr Deputy Speaker, by wishing you and colleagues and all the staff in the House a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Yeah, well done.